Hello, everyone. We're going to continue talking about the Cold War. Today, we're going to be talking about alliances, which alliances are when countries join together, they form an alliance. We're also going to be talking about John F. Kennedy, who was the president for part of the Cold War. And then we're also going to talk about Cuba, which became a communist country during the Cold War. First alliance we're going to talk about is the creation of NATO. In a response to the events associated with the Berlin airlift, NATO was formed as a defensive alliance among the US and Western Europe. Remember, the United States and Western Europe were democratic countries. And NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and was designed to prevent a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. So, a lot of these countries that were democratic, like Spain, France, Italy, Portugal, all these green countries, they were afraid that the Soviet Union and the communism might try to invade. So they formed an alliance. Whereas on the other side, there was the creation of the Warsaw Pact. And after the creation of NATO, the Soviet Union and several countries in Eastern Europe formed the Warsaw Pact, which was also a defensive alliance. And for nearly 50 years, both sides maintained large military forces facing each other in Europe. So, Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, those are all communist countries, they formed an alliance called the Warsaw Pact. And when you see this map, the red countries, those are the communist countries that are part of the Warsaw Pact, whereas the green, those are part of the NATO countries. And for 50 years, there was pretty much the Soviet Union had large military presence right here, whereas the NATO countries had their army right here. And remember, they ended up not fighting each other, but they were close to fighting for a long time. This is just shows you some of the NATO countries: United States, Canada, Greenland, Iceland, and all these other blue ones. Those are all NATO countries. An American military force in the Cold War. During the Cold War era, millions of Americans served in the military, defending freedom in wars and conflicts that they were not always popular. Many people were killed or wounded as a result of their service. And American ideals of democracy and freedom eventually prevailed in the Cold War struggles with Soviet communism. I'm going to actually delete this side because we're going to talk more about that next time, so don't worry about that. The election of President John F. Kennedy. So John F. Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon in the 1960 presidential election. He is still the youngest person to ever be elected to that office. He was 42 years old. And Kennedy continued the policy of containing communism, which was used by his predecessors. And predecessors are people who were president before him, which that was Truman and Eisenhower. So he continued the policy of containment, which that was containing communism. Remember, we didn't want communism to spread, so we had a policy called containment. If communism spreaded to other countries, we would go to war. And Kennedy pledged in his inaugural address that the United States would pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to ensure the survival and success of liberty. So eventually he said he would fight to save democracy in other countries. So if Germany was being invaded by the Soviet Union, the United States would go fight. He also said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So he wanted people to be patriotic, to want to fight for their country. However, Kennedy was assassinated in 1963 in Dallas, Texas. Assassinated means killed. He was in the back of his car, and somebody from in a building had a shotgun or a sniper gun, and they shot and killed him. Now we're going to talk about communism in Cuba. And Cuba was another site where Cold War confrontations occurred. And Fidel Castro led a communist revolution that took over Cuba in the late 1950s. And many Cubans fled to Florida and later attempted to invade Cuba and overthrow, get rid of Castro with the support of the CIA. So overthrow means to get rid of. A lot of the Cubans that fled and went to Florida, they didn't like Castro. One thing about Castro was he was very brutal. If you didn't agree with him, he would kill you. So a lot of people from Cuba fled to the United States. And a lot of the people that fled to Florida, they later attempted to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. So this invasion, called the Bay of Pigs, failed. And it strengthened Castro's position as Cuba, as well as the country's ties with the Soviet Union. So now communism, they take over Cuba, and Cuba is now a communist country, and they start forming an alliance with the Soviet Union. And as a result, hostilities between the United States and Cuba, Soviet Union, increase. This would lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So the Bay of Pigs is just, here's the Bay of Pigs. The United States, we trained a lot of people who fled Cuba and left, and we wanted them to invade Cuba. However, it didn't go over well. Almost everybody died. It was not a good battle. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, this occurred in 1962, and the Soviet Union stationed missiles in Cuba, instigating the Cuban Missile Crisis. So one thing about Cuba is it's very close to the United States and the Soviet Union. They gave Cuba a ton of missiles and atomic weapons. So I mean, you can imagine people, especially in Florida, were scared because Cuba can just shoot a missile to Florida. And President Kennedy ordered the Soviets to remove their missiles and instituted a naval blockade of Cuba as Soviet ships approached. So the U.S. put boats around Cuba so that Soviet boats would not be able to reach Cuba. So they didn't want people from the Soviet Union coming to Cuba because they were afraid they're going to deliver more weapons. And the blockade included a barrier line in which the United States would fire if a Soviet Union ship crossed it, causing World War III. Soviet Union ships never crossed the line. So the United States said, if you cross this line, we're going to shoot you. And a lot of people were scared because if they did shoot down a Soviet boat, they were afraid World War III started. So thankfully, World War III never happened. And for several days, the world was on the brink of nuclear war. Eventually, Soviet leadership ordered the removal of missiles from Cuba. So they decided to remove all the missiles from Cuba. And just as a recap, the United States, they put boats all around Cuba. And that way the Soviet Union was not able to get anything in. And eventually the Soviet Union agreed to take all their weapons back. So there was no more nuclear weapons in Cuba. All right, if you guys have any questions, let me know.